Introduction. I first encountered the dance of Shiva in the Indian Institute of Advanced Study Library in Shimla. I was working on my PhD thesis, and thanks to my husband being a fellow at the institute, I had access to the wonderful library collection there. One of my chapters dealt with Shiva in the form of Nataraj, exemplified in the icons in stone and bronze of the Chola period. I remember reading with awe the description that COOMARASWAMY gave of the philosophical dimensions of Shiva's dance, thereby interpreting the icon of Nataraj to be the perfect amalgam of the mythical, philosophical and aesthetic aspects of Indian culture. I was greatly moved by COOMARASWAMY's interpretation, and in fact it influenced my reading of the rich iconographic material that I was working with, in the context of South India. One of the major arguments that COOMARASWAMY makes with regard to Shiva's dance relates to its cosmic significance, symbolizing the creation, maintenance and destruction of the universe, and ultimately its rejuvenation. In other words, the dance of Shiva is the signifier of cosmic activity envisaged in 5 aspects: Panchakritya, Srishti or creation, Sthiti or maintenance, Samhara or destruction, Tirobhava or disappearance, concealment and Anugraha or grace. In fact, the Panchaksharat 5 syllables in Shiva's name, Nama Shivaya, are themselves seen as representing this 5-fold creative activity of the god. What Shiva creates is the manifest and unmanifest world, what he destroys are the illusory bonds that fetter not only the world at large, but every individual soul in the cosmos. The symbolism of fire, a visual connect between the earth and sky, the perceived and the intuitive, and the tangible and the intangible, is analyzed through the association of Shiva's dance with the burning grounds. This is then represented in the beautiful circle of fire, the Tiruvasi, that encompasses the icon of Shiva as Nataraj in the Indic imagination. The Ananda or bliss of Shiva's dance, ultimately, is to meditate upon the breaking of Maya illusion, the trampling of Mala, Anava and Avidya evil, and the freeing of the soul from the bonds of karma causality rebirth. I am certain that no one who reads this essay on the dance of Shiva can remain unmoved by it, which explains why from Rabindranath Tagore to Fritjof Capra to Romain Rolland, luminaries have lavished praise on it. Ananda Kentish COOMARASWAMY was born on the 22nd of August 1877 in Colombo. His father was Sir Muthu COOMARASWAMY, a distinguished figure in Sinhala political life, who became a Tamil representative of the Legislative Council in the system of separate electorates introduced during British colonial rule. His mother was an Englishwoman, Elizabeth Clay Beebe. When his father died 2 years after his birth, his mother returned to England, with infant Ananda in tow. He received the best of education apparently, and was awarded the bachelor's degree in geology and botany in 1900. He was appointed the director of the Mineralogical Survey of Ceylon in 1903, and continued to hold the post until 1907. He traveled around the country extensively, a job requirement, and in the process got to learn about the traditional arts and crafts of Sri Lanka. His first publication, Medieval Sinhalese Art, 1908, was the result of these initial efforts, and remains one of the best catalogues of the region's craft traditions. Perhaps his travels inspired him, or it could be that actually living in the colony instead of the metropolis led him to understand the significance of nationalism in the Indian subcontinent and in Sri Lanka. And of course, one can't forget that his father himself was a well-known political figure. At any rate, COOMARASWAMY entered the public domain not merely as a government servant but also as a social reformer with a political agenda. He founded the Ceylon Social Reform Society in 1905, and published a journal, the Ceylon National Review, from 1906 to 1911. The philosophy behind this organization and its activities was to retrieve and rejuvenate the traditional society of Sri Lanka, embodied in the village communities that were untouched by the phony westernization of the educated urban population. In a rather Gandhian manner, he declared that the village truly could bring about modern progress, and not industrialization, because the community ensured that the economic security of all its members was ensured. Coomaraswamy's romantic idealization of the illiterate village who carried with him an intrinsic knowledge about the unbreakable bonds between nature, life and a higher being, he often used the term interchangeably with God despite the unkind criticism, did not stem from any parochialism. On the contrary, he often talked of two essential requisites for social reform. First, that the basis for the revitalization of society should be cultural pluralism, and hence all Sri Lankans should be taught Sanskrit, Pali, Sinhala and Tamil so that they could truly appreciate their culture. Related to this, that the Sri Lanka heritage cannot be separated from the Indian one. Second, which was ideally the requirement of the modern times, was the blending of the superior features of Eastern civilization with the best features of the West. From the 1930s, it is believed that Coomaraswamy was greatly influenced by the traditionalist movement spearheaded by René Guénon in France, and particularly its evocation of the Philosophia Perennis. The latter affirmed the creation of all religions and philosophies from one primordial source, which explained the essential unity and truth of all great traditions. Coomaraswamy's constant exhortation, when talking of Hindu and Buddhist art, of the underlying symbolism, cultural ideas and values that colored every aspect of art and architectural design, led him to express this idea of the perennial flow of the philosophical core of particularly the Eastern civilizations. Hence, when he pointed to the villager or someone rooted to the community as carrying with him this sense of the past, he was essentially referring to this value system. He was convinced that no study of Indian art, or indeed of any culture, would be complete with a clinical analysis of measurement and structure, even with written texts as the authority. For him, the ordinary artisan who was illiterate but who had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him, carried this sense of what constituted the essence of that religion and symbolic universe. This is why, no matter which part of the subcontinent you went to, you would feel, despite the regional variations, a sense of déjà vu hit you. These then were the concerns that informed Ananda Coomaraswamy's writings, be they academic analyses of early Indian architecture or his more polemical essays on nationalism. Today, it is the fashion to debunk Coomaraswamy and his philosophy of art, and most scholars would try to distance themselves from his interpretative frameworks. He has been roundly condemned for his exoticization and romanticizing of Indian, what he meant actually was, South Asian, culture and tradition. Some have even accused him of over-reading the sources. His ideas are seen as bordering on obscurantism, and he is condemned for valorizing patriarchal and other regressive social norms. This is especially with regard to his more political and reformist essays. Over the past decade, teaching a course on the history of early Indian art and architecture in JNU, Coomaraswamy has re-entered my frames of reference in major way. I find myself faced with a peculiar problem when I discuss the work of stalwarts like Coomaraswamy and another legend in the field of art, Stella Kramrisch. Students refuse to read them unmediated by the fashionistas of the art history world, and very often there is an empty echoing of the sophisticated critiques of the apparently traditionalist viewpoint. Coomaraswamy was no fool, and he vehemently denied the label of traditionalist that he accused some critics as employing for the sake of convenience, to avoid acknowledging the core questions he and others were raising. That the appreciation of ancient art in the 19th and early 20th centuries was mired in the cultural degeneration of contemporary Europe, and the manufacture of the art object had removed it from the realm of art to that of commerce. It may have been appropriate for him to talk of the European colonial domination with regard to the first point. In many ways, his critique of modern art and art sensibilities anticipated the more sophisticated articulation by Walter Benjamin, titled, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, 1938. Although Coomaraswamy was deeply suspicious of Marxists, Benjamin's ideological positioning led him to reflect deeply on contexts of production as well. He says, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence. Again, that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is the horror of the work of art. This is a symptomatic process whose significance points beyond the realm of art. One might generalize by saying, the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. Obviously, Coomaraswamy was not alone in recognizing the refashioning of taste, culture and particularly consumption by modernity in post-industrialized societies of the West. But possibly what attracts the plentiful criticism that is laid at his door is his open avowal of the philosophy of perennialism. To my mind, no one who has traveled the length and breadth of India, and indeed South Asia, would dispute Coomaraswamy's claim about how the local knowledge keepers, whom we tend to dismiss summarily, often reveal deep insights into the history and culture of that site, locality and even region. More importantly, I have read a number of scholarly works that describe, enumerate and categorize monuments that leave me untouched. They could be talking about anything under the sun. They are that banal. Even worse for me is the high theoretical spiel that gets thrown at us ever so often in the name of art appreciation, where when I do manage to plod through some of these I wonder if we are talking about the same object, monument culture. I am not advocating an uncritical acceptance of Coomaraswamy's ideas and writings. But I do think that by pushing his insights outside our frames of analyses, we would be doing him and ourselves a great disservice. The Dance of Shiva remains one of my favorite readings, and in this collection of essays, we have an interesting mix of scholarly wisdom, social activism and political rhetoric. This year, we have just passed the 135th birth anniversary of ANANDA Coomaraswamy, and I am happy that, in a fitting tribute to the great thinker, Rupa is reissuing this volume. The academic and the general reader will find this volume valuable as much for the insights it gives you into the life and times of ANANDA Coomaraswamy as for its scholarship. What has India contributed to human welfare? Each race contributes something essential to the world's civilization in the course of its own self-expression and self-realization. The character built up in solving its own problems, in the experience of its own misfortunes, is itself a gift which each offers to the world. The essential contribution of India, then, is simply her Indianness. Her great humiliation would be to substitute or to have substituted for this own character, Swabhava, a cosmopolitan veneer, for then indeed she must come before the world empty-handed. If now we ask what is most distinctive in this essential contribution, we must first make it clear that there cannot be anything absolutely unique in the experience of any race. Its peculiarities will be chiefly a matter of selection and emphasis, certainly not a difference in specific humanity. If we regard the world as a family of nations, then we shall best understand the position of India, which has passed through many experiences and solved many problems which younger races have hardly yet recognized. The heart and essence of the Indian experience is to be found in a constant intuition of the unity of all life, and the instinctive and ineradicable conviction that the recognition of this unity is the highest good and the uttermost freedom. All that India can offer to the world proceeds from her philosophy. This philosophy is not, indeed, unknown to others. It is equally the gospel of Jesus and of Blake, Lavzay, and Rumi, but nowhere else has it been made the essential basis of sociology and education. Every race must solve its own problems, and those of its own day. I do not suggest that the ancient Indian solution of the special Indian problems, though its lessons may be many and valuable, can be directly applied to modern conditions. What I do suggest is that the Hindus grasped more firmly than others the fundamental meaning and purpose of life, and more deliberately than others organized society with a view to the attainment of the fruit of life. And this organization was designed, not for the advantage of a single class, but, to use a modern formula, to take from each according to his capacity, and to give to each according to his needs. How far the rishis succeeded in this aim may be a matter of opinion. We must not judge of Indian society, especially Indian society in its present moment of decay, as if it actually realized the Brahmanical social ideas. Yet even with all its imperfections, Hindu society as it survives will appear to many to be superior to any form of social organization attained on a large scale anywhere else, and infinitely superior to the social order which we know as modern civilization. But even if it were impossible to maintain this view, and a majority of Europeans and of English-educated Indians certainly believe to the contrary, what nevertheless remains is the most conspicuous special character of the Indian culture, and its greatest significance for the modern world, is the evidence of a constant effort to understand the meaning and the ultimate purpose of life, and a purposive organization of society in harmony with that order, and with a view to the attainment of the purpose. The Brahmanical idea is an Indian city of the gods, as Devanagari, the name of the Sanskrit script, suggests. The building of that city anew is the constant task of civilization, and though the details of our plans may change, and the contours of our building, we may learn from India to build on the foundations of the religion of eternity. Where the Indian mind differs most from the average mind of modern Europe is in its view of the value of philosophy. In Europe and America, the study of philosophy is regarded as an end in itself, and as such it seems of but little importance to the ordinary man. In India, on the contrary, philosophy is not regarded primarily as a mental gymnastic, but rather, and with deep religious conviction, as our salvation, moksha, from the ignorance, avidya, which forever hides from our eyes the vision of reality. Philosophy is the key to the map of life, by which are set forth the meaning of life and the means of attaining its goal. It is no wonder, then, that the Indians have pursued the study of philosophy with enthusiasm, for these are matters that concern all. There is a fundamental difference between the Brahman and the modern view of politics. The modern politician considers that idealism in politics is unpractical, time enough, he thinks, to deal with social misfortunes when they arise. The same outlook may be recognized in the fact that modern medicine lays greater stress on cure than on prevention, i.e., endeavors to protect against unnatural conditions rather than to change the social environment. The Western sociologist is apt to say, the teachings of religion and philosophy may or may not be true, but in any case they have no significance for the practical reformer. The Brahmins, on the contrary, considered all activity not directed in accordance with a consistent theory of the meaning and purpose of life as supremely unpractical. Only one condition permits us to excuse the indifference of the European individual to philosophy. It is that the struggle to exist leaves him no time for reflection. Philosophy can only be known to those who are alike disinterested and free from care, and Europeans are not thus free, whatever their political status. Where modern industrialism prevails, the Brahman, Kshatriya, and Shudra alike are exploited by the Vaishya, and where in this way commerce settles on every tree, there must be felt continual anxiety about a bare subsistence. The victim of industry must confine his thoughts to the subject of tomorrow's food for himself and his family. The mere will to life takes precedence of the will to power. If at the same time it is decided that every man's voice is to count equally in the councils of the nation, it follows naturally that the voice of those who think must be drowned by that of those who do not think and have no leisure. This position leaves all classes alike at the mercy of unscrupulous individual exploitation, for all political effort lacking a philosophical basis becomes merely opportunist. The problem of modern Europe is to discover her own aristocracy and to learn to obey its will. It is just this problem which India long since solved for herself in her own way. Indian philosophy is essentially the creation of the two upper classes of society, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. To the latter are due most of its forward movements, to the former its elaboration, systematization, mythical representation, and application. The Brahmins possessed not merely the genius for organization, but also the power to enforce their will. For, whatever may be the failings of individuals, the Brahmins as a class are men whom other Hindus have always agreed to reverence, and still regard with the highest respect and affection. The secret of their power is manifold, but it is above all in the nature of their appointed dharma, of study, teaching, and renunciation. Of Buddhism I shall not speak at great length, but rather in parenthesis, for the Buddhists never directly attempted to organize human society, thinking that, rather than concern himself with polity, the wise man should leave the dark state of life in the world to follow the bright state of the mendicant. Buddhist doctrine is a medicine solely directed to save the individual from burning, not in a future hell, but in the present fire of his own thirst. It assumes that to escape from the eternal recurrence is not merely the summum bonum, but the whole purpose of life. He is the wisest who devotes himself immediately to this end, he the most loving who devotes himself to the enlightenment of others. Buddhism has nevertheless deep and lasting effects on Indian statecraft. For just as the Brahman philosopher advised and guided his royal patrons, so did the Buddhist ascetics. The sentiment of friendliness mete, through its effect upon individual character, reacted upon social theory. It is difficult to separate what is Buddhist from what is Indian generally, but we may fairly take the statesmanship of the great Buddhist emperor Ashoka as an example of the effect of Buddhist teaching upon character and policy. His famous edicts very well illustrate the little accepted truth that, in the Orient, from ancient times, national government has been based on benevolence, and directed to securing the welfare and happiness of the people. One of the most significant of the edicts deals with true conquest. Previous to his acceptance of the Buddhist Dharma, Ashoka had conquered the neighboring kingdom of the Kalingas, and added their territory to his own. But now, says the edict, His Majesty feels remorse for having conquered the Kalingas, because the conquest of a country previously unconquered involves the slaughter, death, and carrying away captive of the people. That is a matter of profound sorrow and regret to His Sacred Majesty. His Sacred Majesty desires that all animate beings should have security, self-control, peace of mind, and joyousness. My sons and grandsons, who may be, should not regard it as their duty to conquer a new conquest. If perchance they become engaged in a conquest by arms, they should take pleasure in patience and gentleness, and regard as the only true conquest won by piety. That avails both for this world and the next. In another edict, His Sacred and Gracious Majesty the King does reverence to men of all sects, whether ascetics or householders. Elsewhere he announces the establishment of hospitals, and the appointment of officials, to consider the case where a man has a large family, has been smitten by calamity, or is advanced in years. He orders that animals should not be killed for his stable, he commands that shade and fruit trees should be planted by the high roads, and he exhorts all men to strive hard. He quotes the Buddhist saying, "All men are my children." The annals of India, and especially of Ceylon, can show us other Buddhist kings of the same temper. But it will be seen that such effects of Buddhist teachings have their further consequences mainly through benevolent despotism, and the moral order established by one wise king may be destroyed by his successors. Buddhism, so far as I know, never attempted to formulate a constitution or to determine the social order. Just this, however, the Brahmins attempted in many ways, and to a great extent achieved, and it is mainly their application of religious philosophy to the problems of sociology which forms the subject of the present discussion. The Kshatriya Brahman solution of the ultimate problems of life is given in the early Upanishads. It is a form of absolute according to Shankaracharya, or modified according to Ramanuja monism. Filled with enthusiasm for this doctrine of the unity or interdependence of all life, the Brahman utopists set themselves to found a social order upon the basis provided. In the great epic, they represented the desired social order as having actually existed in a golden past, and they put into the mouths of the epic heroes not only their actual philosophy, but the theory of its practical application, thus, above all, in the long discourses of the dying Bhishma. The heroes themselves they made ideal types of character for the guidance of all subsequent generations, for the education of India has been accomplished deliberately through hero worship. In the Dharmashastra of Manu and the Arthashastra of Chanakya, perhaps the most remarkable sociological documents the world possesses, they set forth the picture of the ideal society, defined from the standpoint of law. By these and other means they accomplished what has not yet been effected in any other country in making religious philosophy the essential and intelligible basis of popular culture and national polity. What, then, is the Brahman view of life? To answer this at length, to expound the science of the self, Adhyatma Vidya, which is the religion and philosophy of India, would require considerable space. We have already indicated that this science recognizes the unity of all life, one source, one essence, and one goal, and regards the realization of this unity as the highest good, bliss, salvation, freedom, the final purpose of life. This is for Hindu thinkers eternal life, not an eternity in time, but the recognition here and now of all things in the self in all. More than all else, says Kabir, who may be said to speak for India, do I cherish at heart that love which makes me to live a limitless life in this world. This inseparable unity of the material and spiritual world is made the foundation of the Indian culture, and determines the whole character of her social ideals. How, then, could the Brahmins tolerate the practical diversity of life? How provide for the fact that a majority of individuals are guided by selfish aims? How could they deal with the problem of evil? They had found the religion of eternity, Nirguna Vidya. What of the religion of time, Saguna Vidya? This is the critical point of religious sociology, when it remains to be seen whether the older idealist, it is old souls that are idealistic, the young are short-sighted, can remember his youth, and can make provision for the interest and activities of spiritual immaturity. To fail here is to divide the church from the everyday life, and to create the misleading distinction of sacred and profane. To succeed is to illuminate daily life with the light of heaven. The life or lives of man may be regarded as constituting a curve, an arc of time experience subtended by the duration of the individual will to life. The outward movement on this curve, evolution, the path of pursuit, the pravriti marga, is characterized by self-assertion. The inward movement, involution, the path of return, the nivritti marga, is characterized by increasing self-realization. The religion of men on the outward path is the religion of time. The religion of those who return is the religion of eternity. If we consider life as one whole, certainly self-realization must be regarded as its essential purpose from the beginning. All our forgetting is but that we may remember the more vividly. But though it is true that in most men the two phases of experience interpenetrate, we shall best understand the soul of man, drawn as it is in the two opposite, or seeming opposite, directions of affirmation and denial, will and will surrender, by separate consideration of the outward and the inward tendencies. Brahmins avoid the theological use of the terms good and evil, and prefer to speak of knowledge and ignorance, vidya and avidya, and of the three qualities of sattva, rajas, and tamas. As knowledge increases, so much the more will a man of his own motion, and not from any sense of duty, tend to return, and his character and actions will be more purely sattvic. But we need not on that account condemn the self-assertion of the ignorant as sin, for could self-realization be where self-assertion had never been? It is not sin, but youth, and to forbid the satisfaction of the thirst of youth is not a cure. Rather, as we realize more clearly, everyday desires suppressed breed pestilence. The Brahmins, therefore, notwithstanding the austere rule appointed for themselves, held that an ideal human society must provide for the enjoyment of all pleasures by those who wish for them. They would say, perhaps, that those who have risen above the mere gratification of the senses, and beyond a life of mere pleasure, however refined, are just those who have already tasted pleasure to the full. For reasons of this kind, it was held that the acquisition of wealth, artha, and the enjoyment of sense pleasure, kama, subject to such law, dharma, as may protect the weak against the strong, are the legitimate preoccupations of those on the outward path. This is the stage attained by modern Western society, of which the norm is competition regulated by ethical restraint. Beyond this stage, no society can progress unless it is subjected to the creative will of those who have passed beyond the stage of most extreme egoism, whether we call them heroes, guardians, Brahmins, samurai, or simply men of genius. Puritanism consists in a desire to impose the natural asceticism of age upon the young, and this position is largely founded on the untenable theories of an absolute ethic and an only true theology. The opposite extreme is illustrated in industrial society, which accepts the principles of competition and self-assertion as a matter of course, while it denies the value of philosophy and discipline. Brahman sociology, just because of its philosophical basis, avoided both errors in adopting the theory of Sva dharma, the own morality, appropriate to the individual according to his social and spiritual status, and the doctrine of the many forms of Ishvara, which is so clumsily interpreted by the missionaries as polytheistic. However much the Brahmins held self-realization to be the end of life, the summum bonum, they saw very clearly that it would be illogical to impose the same immediately upon those members of the community who are not yet weary of self-assertion. It is most conspicuously in this understanding tolerance that Brahman sociology surpasses other systems. At this point, we must digress to speak briefly of the doctrine of reincarnation, which is involved in the theory of eternal recurrence. This doctrine is assumed and built upon by Brahman sociologists, and on this account we must clearly understand its practical applications. We must not assume that reincarnation is a superstition which, if it could be definitely refuted, and that is a considerable if, would have as a theory no practical value. It is a fakanda par, valid only for so long as we attribute a real being to the ego that is not myself. In truth, as Sankara says, the Lord is the only transmigrant, and that art thou, not what thou classest, I, or myself. Even atoms and electrons are but symbols, and do not represent tangible objects like marbles, which we could see if we had large enough microscopes. The practical value of a theory does not depend on its representative character, but on its efficacy in resuming past observation and forecasting future events. The doctrine of reincarnation corresponds to a fact which everyone must have remarked: the varying age of the souls of men, irrespective of the age of the body counted in years. A man is not an elder because his head is grey, Dhammapada. Sometimes we see an old head on young shoulders. Some men remain irresponsible, self-assertive, uncontrolled, unapt to their last day. Others from their youth are serious, self-controlled, talented, and friendly. We must understand the doctrine of reincarnation at any rate as an artistic or mythical representation of these facts. To these facts the Brahmins rightly attached great importance, for it is this variation of temperament or inheritance which constitutes the natural inequality of men, an inequality that is too often ignored in the theories of Western democracy. We can now examine the Brahmanical theory a little more closely. An essential factor is to be recognized in the dogma of the rhythmic character of the world process. This rhythm is determined by the great antithesis of subject and object, self and not self, will and matter, unity and diversity, love and hate, and all other pairs. The interplay of these opposites constitutes the whole of sensational and registratable existence, the eternal becoming samsara, which is characterized by birth and death, evolution and involution, descent and ascent, srishti and samhara. Every individual life, mineral, vegetable, animal, human, or personal god, has a beginning and an end, and this creation and destruction, appearance and disappearance, are of the essence of the world process and equally originate in the past, the present, and the future. According to this view, then, every individual ego, Jivatman, or separate expression of the general will to life, Ichha, Krishna, must be regarded as having reached a certain stage of its own cyclicity. The same is true of the collective life of a nation, a planet, or a cosmic system. It is further considered that the turning point of this curve is reached in man, and hence the immeasurable value which Hindus and Buddhists attach to birth in human form. Before the turning point is reached, to use the language of Christian theology, the natural man prevails. After it is past, regenerate man. The turning point is not to be regarded as sudden, for the two conditions interpenetrate, and the change of psychological center of gravity may occupy a succession of lives, or if the turning seems to be a sudden event, it is only in the sense that the fall of a ripe fruit appears sudden. According to their position on the great curve, that is to say, according to their spiritual age, we can recognize three prominent types of men. There is first the mob, of those who are preoccupied with the thought of I and mine, whose objective is self-assertion, but are restrained on the one hand by fear of retaliation and of legal or after-death punishment, and on the other by the beginnings of love of family and love of country. These, in the main, are the devourers of Blake, the slaves of nature. Next there is a smaller, but still larger number of thoughtful and good men whose behavior is largely determined by a sense of duty, but whose inner life is still the field of conflict between the old Adam and the new man. Men of this type are actuated on the one hand by the love of power and fame, and ambition more or less noble, and on the other by the disinterested love of mankind. But this type is rarely pan-human, and its outlook is often simultaneously unselfish and narrow. In times of great stress, the men of this type reveal their true nature, showing to what extent they have advanced more or less than has appeared. But all these, who have but begun to taste of freedom, must still be guided by rules. Finally, there is the much smaller number of great men, heroes, saviors, saints, and avatars, who have definitely passed the period of greatest stress and have attained peace, or at least have attained to occasional and unmistakable vision of life as a whole. These are the prolific of Blake, the masters of nature, the true Brahmins in their own right, and partake of the nature of the Superman and the Bodhisattva. Their activity is determined by their love and wisdom, and not by rules. In the world, but not of it, they are the flower of humanity, our leaders and teachers. These classes constitute the natural hierarchy of human society. The Brahman sociologists were firmly convinced that in an ideal society, i.e., a society designed deliberately by man for the fulfillment of his own purpose, Purushartha, not only must opportunity be allowed to everyone for such experience as his spiritual status requires, but also that the best and wisest must rule. It seemed to them impossible that an ideal society should have any other than an aristocratic basis, the aristocracy being at once intellectual and spiritual. Being firm believers in heredity, both of blood and culture, they conceived that it might be possible to constitute an ideal society upon the already existing basis of occupational caste. If, thought they, we can determine natural classes, then let us assign to each its appropriate duties, swadharma, own norm, and appropriate honor. This will at once facilitate a convenient division of necessary labor, ensure the handing down of hereditary skill in pupillary succession, avoid all possibility of social ambition, and will allow to every individual the experience and activity which he needs and owes. They assume that by a natural law, the individual ego is always, or nearly always, born into its own befitting environment. If they were wrong on this point, then it remains for others to discover some better way of achieving the same ends. I do not say that this is impossible, but it can hardly be denied that the Brahmanical caste system is the nearest approach that has yet been made towards a society where there shall be no attempt to realize a competitive quality, but where all interests are regarded as identical. To those who admit the variety of age in human souls, this must appear to be the only true communism. To describe the caste system as an idea or an actual practice would require a whole volume. But we may notice a few of its characteristics. The nature of the difference between a Brahman and a Shudra is indicated in the view that a Shudra can do no wrong, a view that must make an immense demand upon the patience of the higher castes, and is the absolute converse of the Western doctrine that the king can do no wrong. These facts are well illustrated in the doctrine of legal punishment, that of the Vaishya should be twice as heavy as that of the Shudra, that of the Kshatriya twice as heavy again, that of the Brahman twice or even 4 times as heavy again in respect of the same offense, for responsibility rises with intelligence and status. The Shudra is also free of innumerable forms of self-denial imposed upon the Brahman. He may, for example, indulge in coarse food, the widow may remarry. It may be observed that it was strongly held that the Shudra should not by any means outnumber the other castes. If the Shudras are too many, as befell in ancient Greece, where the slaves outnumbered the freemen, the voice of the least wise may prevail by mere weight of numbers. Modern craftsmen interested in the regulation of machinery will be struck by the fact that the establishment and working of large machines in factories by individuals was reckoned a grievous sin. Large organizations are only to be carried on in the public interest. Given the natural classes, one of the good elements of what is now regarded as democracy was provided by making the castes self-governing. Thus it was secured that a man should be tried by his peers, whereas, under industrial democracy, an artist may be tried by a jury of tradesmen, or a poacher by a bench of squires. Within the caste there existed equality of opportunity for all, and the caste as a body had collective privileges and responsibilities. Society thus organized has much the appearance of what would now be called guild socialism. In a just and healthy society, function should depend upon capacity, and in the normal individual, capacity and inclination are inseparable. This is the instinct of workmanship. We are able accordingly to recognize, in the theory of the syndicalists, as well as in the caste organization of India, a very nearly ideal combination of duty and pleasure, compulsion and freedom, and the words vocation or dharma imply this very identity. Individualism and socialism are united in the concept of function. The Brahmanical theory has also a far-reaching bearing on the problems of education. Reading, says the Garuda Purana, to a man devoid of wisdom, is like a mirror to the blind. The Brahmins attached no value to uncoordinated knowledge or to unearned opinions, but rather regarded these as dangerous tools in the hands of unskilled craftsmen. The greatest stress is laid on the development of character. Proficiency in hereditary aptitudes is assured by pupillary succession within the caste. But it is in respect of what we generally understand by higher education that the Brahman method differs most from modern ideals, for it is not even contemplated as desirable that all knowledge should be made accessible to all. The key to education is to be found in personality. There should be no teacher for whom teaching is less than a vocation, none may sell the Vedas, and no teacher should impart his knowledge to a pupil until he finds the pupil ready to receive it, and the proof of this is to be found in the asking of the right questions. As the man who digs with a spade obtains water, even so an obedient pupil obtains the knowledge which is in his teacher. The relative position of man and woman is also very noteworthy. Perhaps the woman is in general a younger soul, as Paracelsus puts it, nearer to the world than man. But there is no war of words as to which is the superior, which inferior, for the question of competitive equality is not considered. The Hindu marriage contemplates identity, and not equality. The primary motif of marriage is not merely individual satisfaction, but the achievement of Purushartha, the purposes of life, and the wife is spoken of as Sahadharmacharini, she who cooperates in the fulfillment of social and religious duties. In the same way for the community at large, the system of caste is designed rather to unite than to divide. Men of different castes have more in common than men of different classes. It is in an industrial democracy, and where a system of secular education prevails, that groups of men are effectually separated. A Western professor and a navvy do not understand each other half so well as a Brahman and a Shudra. It has been justly remarked that the lowest pariah hanging to the skirts of Hindu society is in a sense as much the disciple of the Brahman ideal as any priest himself. It remains to apply what has been said to immediate problems. I have suggested that India has nothing of more value to offer to the world than her religious philosophy, and her faith in the application of philosophy to social problems. A few words may be added on the present crisis in the relationship of East and West. Let us understand first that what we see in India is a cooperative society as a state of decline. Western society has never been so highly organized, but insofar as it was organized, its disintegration has proceeded much further than is yet the case in India. And we may expect that Europe, having sunk into industrial competition first, will be the first to emerge. The seeds of a future cooperation have long been sown, and we can clearly recognize a conscious, and perhaps also an unconscious, effort towards reconstruction. In the meantime, the decay of Asia proceeds, partly of internal necessity, because at the present moment the social change from cooperation to competition is spoken of as progress, and because it seems to promise the ultimate recovery of political power, and partly as the result of destructive exploitation by the industrialists. Even those European thinkers who may be called the prophets of the New Age are content to think of a development taking place in Europe alone. But let it be clearly realized that the modern world is not the ancient world of slow communications. What is done in India or Japan today has immediate spiritual and economic results in Europe and America. To say that East is East and West is simply to hide one's head in the sand. It will be quite impossible to establish any higher social order in the West so long as the East remains infatuated with the, to her, entirely novel and fascinating theory of laissez-faire. The rapid degradation of Asia is thus an evil portent for the future of humanity and for the future of that Western social idealism of which the beginnings are already recognizable. If, either in ignorance or in contempt of Asia, constructive European thought omits to seek the cooperation of Eastern philosophers, there will come a time when Europe will not be able to fight industrialism, because this enemy will be entrenched in Asia. It is not sufficient for the English colonies in America to protect themselves by immigration laws against cheap Asiatic labor. That is a merely temporary device, and likely to do more harm than good, even apart from its injustice. Nor will it be possible for the European nationalist ideal that every nation should choose its own form of government, and lead its own life, to be realized, so long as the European nations have, or desire to have, possessions in Asia. What has to be secured is the conscious cooperation of East and West for common ends, not the subjection of either to the other, nor their lasting estrangement. For if Asia be not with Europe, she will be against her, and there may arise a terrible conflict, economic, or even armed, between an idealistic Europe and a materialized Asia. To put the matter in another way, we do not fully realize the debt that Europe already owes to Asiatic thought, for the discovery of Asia has hardly begun. And, on the other hand, Europe has inflicted terrible injuries upon Asia in modern times. I do not mean to say that the virus of civilization would not have spread through Asia quite apart from any direct European attempts to effect such a result, quite on the contrary, but it cannot be denied that those who have been the unconscious instruments of the degradation of Asiatic society from the basis of dharma to the basis of contract have incurred a debt. The clear air of Asia is not merely a dream of the past. There is idealism, and there are idealists in modern India, even amongst those who have been corrupted by half a century of squalid education. We are not all deceived by the illusion of progress, but, like some of our European colleagues, desire the coming of better conditions of life, when the whole world will again learn that the object of human life is not to waste it in a feverish anxiety and race after physical objects and comforts, but to use it in developing the mental, moral, and spiritual powers latent in man. The debt, then, of Europe can best be paid, and with infinite advantage to herself, by seeking the cooperation of modern Asia in every adventure of the spirit which Europe would essay. It is true that this involves the hard surrender of the old idea that it is the mission of the West to civilize the East, but that somewhat Teutonic and imperial view of culture is already discredited. What is needed for the common civilization of the world is the recognition of common problems, and to cooperate in their solution. If it be asked what inner riches India brings to aid in the realization of a civilization of the world, then, from the Indian standpoint, the answer must be found in her religions and her philosophy, and her constant application of abstract theory to practical life. Hindu view of art. History of aesthetic. The earliest Indian art of which we have any information or concerning which we are able to draw reasonably certain inferences, we may designate as Vedic, since we can hardly undertake here the discussion of the perhaps contemporary culture of the early Dravidians. Vedic art was essentially practical. About painting and sculpture we have no knowledge, but the carpenter, metal worker and potter and weaver efficiently provided for man's material requirements. If their work was decorated, we may be sure that its ornament had often, and perhaps always, a magical and protected significance. The ends of poetry were also practical. The Vedic hymns were designed to persuade the gods to deal generously with men. As birds extend their sheltering wings, spread your protection over us. Rigveda. Much of this poetry is descriptive. It is nature poetry in the sense that it deals with natural phenomena. Its most poetical quality is its sense of wonder and admiration, but it is lyrical in any other sense. It has no tragic or reflective elements, except in some of the later hymns, and there is no question of aesthetic contemplation, for the conception of the sympathetic constantly prevails. The poet sometimes comments on his own work, which he compares to a car well built by a deft craftsman, or to fair and well-woven garments, or to a bride adorned for her lover, and this art it was that made the hymns acceptable to the gods to whom they were addressed. Vedic aesthetic consisted essentially in the appreciation of skill. The keynote of the Upanishads 500 BC. And Pali Buddhism is the search for truth. The ancient hymns had become a long-established institution, taken for granted. Ritual was followed solely for the sake of advantage in this world or the next. Meanwhile, the deeper foundations of Indian culture were in the process of determination in the mental struggle of the dwellers in the forest. The language of the Upanishads combines austerity with passion, but this passion is the exaltation of mental effort, remote from the common life of men in the world. Only here and there we find glimpses of the later fusion of lyric and religious experience, when, for example, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the bliss of Atman intuition, or the intuition of the self, is compared with the happiness of earthly lovers in self-forgetting preoccupied with deeper speculations to exhibit a conscious art, or to discuss the art of their times. In this age there is no explicit aesthetic. When, however, we consider the Indian way of regarding the Vedas as a whole, we shall find implicit in the word, Shruti, a very important doctrine, that the Veda is eternal, the sacred books are its temporal expression, they have been heard. This is not a theory of revelation, in the ordinary sense, since the audition depends on the qualification of the hearer, not on the will and active manifestation of a god. But it is on all fours with later Hindu view which treats the practice of art as a form of yoga, and identifies aesthetic emotion with that felt when the self perceives the self. In Pali Buddhism generally, an enthusiasm for the truth, unsurpassed even in the Upanishads, is combined with monastic institutionalism and a rather violent polemic against the joys of the world. Beauty and personal love are not merely evanescent, but are snares to be avoided at all costs, and it is clearly indicated that the early Buddhists' aesthetic is strictly hedonistic. The indications of this point of view are summed up in the following pages of the Visuddhi Marga. Living beings, on account of their love and devotion to the sensations excited by forms and the other objects of sense, give high honor to painters, musicians, perfumers, cooks, elixir prescribing physicians, and other like persons who furnish us with objects of sense. In the Upanishads, on the one hand, and in the teachings of Buddha on the other, the deepest problems of life were penetrated. The mists of the Vedic dawn had melted in the fire of austerity, tapas, and life lay open to man's inception as a thing of which the secret mechanism was no more mysterious. We can only scarcely exaggerate the sense of triumph with which the doctrines of the Atman or Self in the Gospel of Buddha permeated Indian society. The immediate result of the acceptance of these views appeared in an organized and deliberate endeavor to create a form of society adapted for the fulfillment of the purposes of life as seen in the light of new philosophies. To the ideal of the saint in retirement was very soon added that of the man who remains in the world and yet acquires or possesses the highest wisdom. It was with works that Janaka and others came unto adeptship. Gita, e. 20. There was now also evolved the doctrine of union karma yoga, set forth in the Bhagavad Gita, as leading even the citizen on the path of salvation. The emergence of a definitely Brahmanical rather than a Buddhist scheme of life is to be attributed to the fact that the practical energies of Buddhists were largely absorbed within the limits of its monasticism. The Buddhists in the main regard nirvana not merely as the ultimate, but as the sole object of life. But the Brahmins never forgot that this life is the field alike of pursuit and return. Their scheme of life is set forth at great length in the Sutra literature, the Dharma Shastras and the epics in general, 4th, 1st centuries BC. This literature yields sufficient material for an elucidation of the orthodox view of art. But notwithstanding the breadth of the fourfold plan, we find in this literature the same hedonistic aesthetic and puritanical applications as characteristic of Pali Buddhism. Thus, Manu forbids the householder to dance or sing or play on musical instruments, and reckons architects, actors and singers amongst the unworthy men who should not be invited to the ceremony of offerings to the dead. Even Chanakya, though he tolerates musicians and actors, classes them with courtesans. The hedonistic theory still prevailed. In later times, the defense of any art, such as poetry or drama, was characteristically based on the fact that it could contribute to the achievement of all or any of the four aims of life. Meanwhile, the stimulus of discovered truth led not only to this austere formulation of a scheme of life, typically in Manu, but also to the development of yoga as a practice for the attainment of the desired end. And in this development an almost equal part was taken by Brahmins and Buddhists, typically in Patanjali and Nagarjuna. We shall digress here, and partially anticipate to discuss briefly the important part once played in Indian thought by the concept of art as yoga, a subject sufficient in itself for a whole volume. It will be remembered that the purpose of yoga is mental concentration, carried so far as the overlooking of all distinction between the subject and the object of contemplation, a means of achieving harmony or unity of consciousness. It was soon recognized that the concentration of the artist was of this very nature, and we find such texts as Shukracharya's Lets the imager establish images in temples by meditation on the deities who are the objects of his devotion. For the successful achievement of this yoga, the lineaments of the image are described in books to be dwelt upon in detail. In no other way, not even by direct and immediate vision of an actual object, is it possible to be so absorbed in contemplation, as thus in the making of images. The manner in which the lesser crafts constitute a practice acharya, analogous to that of Tsamprajanta yoga, is indicated incidentally by Shankaracharya in the commentary on the Brahma Sutra 3:2-10. The subject of discussion is the distinction of swoon from waking. In swoon the senses no longer perceive their objects. Shankaracharya remarks, true, the arrow maker perceives nothing beyond his work when he is buried in it, but he has nevertheless consciousness and control over his body, both of which are absent in the fainting person. The arrowmaker seems to have afforded, indeed, a proverbial instance of single-minded attention, as we read in the Bhagavata Purana. I have learned concentration from the maker of arrows. A connection between dream and art is recognized in a passage of the Agni Purana, where the imager is instructed, on the night before beginning his work, and after ceremonial purification, to pray, O thou Lord of all gods, teach me in dreams how to carry out all the work I have in my mind. Here again we see an anticipation of modern views, which associate myth and dream and art is essentially similar in representing the dramatization of man's innermost hopes and fears. The practice of visualization referred to by Shukracharya is identical in worship and in art. The worshipper recites the Dhyan mantram describing the deity and forms a corresponding mental picture, and it is then to this imagined form that his prayers are addressed and offerings are made. The artist follows identical prescriptions, but proceeds to represent the mental picture in a visible and the objective form, by drawing or modeling. Thus, to take an example from Buddhist sources, the artist sadhaka, mantran, or yogam, as he is variously and significantly called after ceremonial purification, is to proceed to a solitary place. There he is to perform the sevenfold office, beginning with the invocation of the hosts of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and the offering to them of real and imaginary flowers. Then he must realize in thought the four infinite moods of friendliness, compassion, sympathy, and impartiality. Then he must meditate upon the emptiness shunyata, or non-existence of all things, for, by the fire of the idea of the abyss, it is said, there are destroyed beyond recovery the five factors of ego consciousness. Then only should he invoke the desired divinity by the utterance of the appropriate seedword, bija, and should identify himself completely with the divinity to be represented. Then finally, on pronouncing the Dhyan mantram, in which the attributes are defined, the divinity appears visibly, like a reflection, or, as in a dream, and this brilliant image is the artist's model. This ritual is perhaps unduly elaborated, but in essentials it shows a clear understanding of the psychology of the imagination. These essentials are the setting aside the transformations of the thinking principles, self-identification with the object of the work, and vividness of the final image. There are abundant literary parallels for this conception of art as yoga. Thus Valmiki, although he was already familiar with the story of Rama, before composing his own Ramayana sought to realize it more profoundly, and sipping water according to rule, i.e. ceremonial purification, he set himself to yoga contemplation of his theme. By virtue of his yoga power he clearly saw before him Rama, Lakshmana and Sita, and Dashratha, together with his wives, in his kingdom laughing, talking, acting and moving as if in real life. By yoga power that righteous one beheld all that had come to pass, and all that was to come to pass in the future, like neil-leaf fruit on the palm of his hand. And having truly seen all by virtue of his concentration, the generous sage began forth of the history of Rama. Notice here particularly that the work of art is completed, the work of transcription or representation is begun. The mind of the sage, says Chang Tzu, being in repose, becomes the mirror of the universe, the speculum of all creation. Crocer is entirely correct when he speaks of the artist, who never makes a stroke with his brush without having previously seen it with his imagination, and remarks that the externalization of a work of art implies a vigilant will, which persists in not allowing certain visions, intuitions, or representations to be lost. It should be understood that yoga, union, is not merely a mental exercise or a religious discipline, but the most practical preparation for any undertaking whatever. Hanuman, for example, before searching the Ashoka grove for Sita, prayed to the gods and ranged the forest in imagination till he found her, then only did he spring from the walls of Lanka, like an arrow from a bow, and enter the grove in the flesh. Throughout the East, whatever Hindu or Buddhist thought have deeply penetrated, it is family believed that all knowledge is directly accessible to the concentrated and one-pointed mind, without the direct intervention of the senses. Probably all inventors, artists and mathematicians are more or less aware of this as a matter of personal experience. In the language of psychoanalysis, this concentration preparatory to undertaking a specific task is the willed introversion of a creative mind, which, retreating before its own problem and inwardly collecting its forces, dips at least for a moment into the source of life in order there to wrest a little more strength from the mother for the completion of its work, and the result of this reunion is a fountain of youth and new fertility. We've spoken so far of yoga, but for the artist this was rather a means than an end. Just as in medieval Europe, so too, and perhaps even more conspicuously in India, the impulse to iconolatry derived from the spirit of adoration, the loving and passionate devotion to a personal divinity, which we know as bhakti. Patanjali, in the Yoga Sutra, mentions the Lord only as one amongst other suitable objects of contemplation, and without the use of any image being implied. But the purpose of the lover is precisely to establish a personal relation with the beloved, and the plastic symbol is created for this end. A purely abstract philosophy or a psychology like that of early Buddhism does not demand aesthetic expression. It was the spirit of worship which built upon the foundation of Buddhist and Vedantic thought the mansions of Indian religion, which shelter all those whom purely intellectual formulae could not satisfy, the children of this world who will not hurry along the path of release, and the mystics who find a foretaste of freedom in the love of every cloud in the sky and flower at their feet. This was indeed a return to superstition, or at any rate to duality. But what in this world is not a dream and a superstition, certainly not the atoms of science. And for all those who are yet idealists there are, as there must be, idols provided. The superstitions of Hinduism, like those of Christianity, accomplished more for the hearts of men than those of modern materialism. It may well be doubted if art and idolatry and art are not inseparable. Let us observe here that the purpose of the imager was neither self-expression nor the realization of beauty. He did not choose his own problems, but like the Gothic sculptor, obeyed a hieratic canon. He did not regard his own or his fellows' work from the standpoint of connoisseurship or aestheticism, not, that is to say, from the standpoint of the philosopher, or aesthete, but from that of a pious artisan. To him the theme was all in all, and if there is a beauty in his work, this did not arise from aesthetic intention, but from a state of mind which found unconscious expression. In every epoch of great and creative art we observe an identical phenomenon: the artist is preoccupied with his theme. It is only in looking backward, and as philosophers rather than artists, or if we are also artists, a rare combination, then with the philosophic and not the aesthetic side of our mind, that we perceive that the quality of beauty in a work of art is really quite independent of its theme. Then we are apt to forget that beauty has never been reached except through the necessity that was felt to deal with the particular picture, or stand up to dance, and having nothing in us that we feel must be said and said clearly at all costs, we are surprised that the result is insipid and lacks conviction. The subject may be lovely, the dancer may be ravishing, but the picture and the dance are not resonant. The theory of beauty is a matter for philosophers, and artists strive to demonstrate it at their own risk. The Indian imager was concerned with his own problem. It is interesting to see the kind of man he was expected to be. According to one of the Shilpa Shastras, the Shilpam artificer should understand the Atharva Veda, the 32 Shilpa Shastras, and the Vedic mantras by which the deities are invoked. He should be one who wears a sacred thread, a necklace of holy beads, and a ring of kusha grass on his finger, delighting in the worship of God, faithful to his wife, avoiding estranged women, piously acquiring a knowledge of various sciences. Such a one is indeed craftsman. Elsewhere it is said, the painter must be a good man, no sluggard, not given to anger, wholly learned, self-controlled, devout and charitable. Such should be his character. It is added that he should work in solitude, or when another artist is present, never before a layman. In this connection it is very important to realize that the artisan or artist possessed an assured status in the form of a life contract, or rather an hereditary office. He was trained from his childhood as his father's disciple, and followed his father's calling as a matter of course. He was member of a guild, and guilds were recognized and protected by the king. The artificer was protected from competition and undercutting. It is said that any other than Shilpam should build temples, towns, seaports, tanks or wells, is comparable to the sin of murder. This was guild socialism in a non-competitive society. The earliest impulses of Indian art appear to have been more or less practical and secular, and it is perhaps to this fact that we may partly trace the distrust of art exhibited by the early hedonists. On the other hand, the dominant motifs governing its evolution from the 3rd century BC onwards, and up to the close of the 18th century, are devotion bhakti, and reunion yoga. Neither of these is peculiar to India, but they exhibit there a peculiar character which leaves its mark on everything Hindu or Buddhist. Let us follow these traces in very summary reference to actual documents. I have discussed in another chapter the beginnings of Buddhist art. It is in the southern primitives of Amravati and Anuradhapura rather than in the semi-Roman figures of the northwest that we can best observe the development of an art that is distinctively Indian. This is the mainstream, and it is these types from which the suave and gracious forms of Gupta sculpture derive, and these in turn became the models of all Buddhist art in China. In India proper, they grow more and more movement, more dramatic and vigorous, in the classic art of Ellora and Elephanta, Mamallapuram and Ceylon, and form the basis of the immense developments of colonial Buddhist and Hindu art in Java and Cambodia. Gupta and classic painting are preserved at Ajanta. The tender humanism and the profound nature sympathies which are so conspicuous in the painting of Ajanta and the sculpture of Mamallapuram are recognizable equally in the work of poets like Ashwaghosha and Arya Shura and dramatists like Kalidasa. Ashwaghosha says of Prince Siddhartha that one day as he was riding in the country, he saw a piece of land being plowed, with the path of plow broken like waves of water. And regarding the men as they plowed, their faces soiled by the dust, scorched by the sun, chafed by the wind, and their cattle bewildered by the burden of drawing, the all-noble one felt the uttermost compassion, and alighting from the back of his horse, he passed slowly over the earth, overcome with sorrow, pondering the birth and destruction proceeding in the world, he grieved. Nor can anything be more poignant than Shanti Deva's expression of his sense of the eternal movement and insubstantiality of life, who is a kinsman, who a friend, and unto whom. The literature of love is no less remarkable. We recognize here, just as in the painting and sculpture, what is eternal in all art, and universal impassioned vision based on understanding, correlated with cloudless thought and devoid of sentimentality. There is every reason to believe too that this was the time of highest attainment in music. Lastly, this was a time of progress in the field of pure science, especially mathematics and astronomy. From the 4th to the end of 8th century we must regard as golden age of Indian civilization. This was the period of Wei and Tiang in China. Eastern Asia represented then to all intents and purposes the civilization of the world. After the 9th or 10th century there is a general, though certainly not universal, decline in orthodox art, of which the formulae were rapidly stereotyped in their main outlines, and rendered florid in their detail. Classical Sanskrit literature also came to an end in a forest of elaborate embroidery. But great forces, sometimes grouped under the designation of the Puranic Renaissance, had long been at work preparing the way for the emergence of the old cults of Shiva and Vishnu in forms which gave renewed inspiration to art, sculpture and poetry in the south, and poetry and painting in the north. In these devotional faiths was completed the cycle of Indian spiritual evolution from pure philosophy to pure mysticism, from knowledge to love. The inner and outer life were finally unified, a development entirely analogous to that of Zen Buddhism in the Far East. The transparency of life so clearly expressed in the paintings of Ajanta indicated with a renewed emphasis, above all in the Radha-Krishna cults, and in all the northern Vaishnava poetry and painting, the tradition in which Rabindranath Tagore is the latest singer, and of which the theory is plainly set forth in his song. Not my way of salvation, to surrender the world. Rather for me the taste of infinite freedom. While yet I am bound by 1,000 bonds to the wheel. In each glory of sound and sight and scent, I shall find thy infinite joy abiding. My passion shall burn as the flame of salvation. The flower of my love shall become the ripe fruit of devotion. But such a theory is now rather a survival of all that was universal in Indian religion, rather than a new point of departure. The current aesthetic of educated India, a product of a wide miscomprehension of Western culture and a general surrender to nonconformist ethics, is again realistic and hedonistic, and perhaps for the first time illustrative,